This week, I'm going to go over aperture, its effect on exposure, and how it can give you more cinematic shots. Aperture is the opening of the lens. It's like the iris in your eye. By adjusting how large the aperture is, we can control the amount of light entering the camera. There is confusion on why the aperture setting seems to work backwards, where an aperture of 2 is actually larger than an aperture of 20, and therefore the lower aperture number lets in more light. This is because aperture is measured in fractions. The aperture is measured in comparison to the focal length of the lens. So on a 100mm lens, your aperture is measured based on this length. Aperture of 2 is actually read as 1/2 of the focal length, and an aperture of 20 is actually 1/20th. And just like cake, wouldn't 1/2 of a cake be larger than 1/20th of a cake? Each lens has a maximum size the aperture can go. This number is usually stamped on the front of the lens. On zoom lenses, the maximum aperture can change depending on how zoomed in the lens is. This is called a variable aperture. For example, this 50mm lens has a maximum aperture of 1.8, whereas this zoom lens has a maximum aperture of 3.5 zoomed out and 5.6 zoomed in all the way. As we learned earlier, aperture is a main component in controlling how much light enters the camera. A lens that has a larger aperture can let in more light, resulting in better images during dark scenes. If you find yourself struggling with overly grainy images in your indoor shots, and you would like to have more flexibility when shooting on the run, getting a lens with a larger aperture of 2.8 or lower would be beneficial when you can't lug heavy lighting equipment around for your shot. A side effect of having a larger aperture is our depth of field. Because the lens curve controls how much light enters the camera, how large the aperture is affects the area of focus. This diagram shows light passing through a lens. The point where they intersect is what will be in focus. The acceptable range for sharpness is an area around here. If we make the aperture smaller, the beam is narrowed, resulting in more of the picture fitting into this area, and more of the shot is now in focus. So when we have a wide aperture, we can blur out the background and have only our subject in focus. This gets rid of distraction in the scene, so that our audience's attention is immediately brought to what we want them to look at. For wide establishing shots, we can use a higher aperture to keep the audience grounded and know where they are, before coming in for a tight shot that shows something very specific. Because aperture has this creative effect, we may want to use an aperture that is wide open in an area that is already very bright. In this case, an ND filter will help us keep the style of shot we want, without overexposing the shot. If you plan on getting a shallow depth of field on a sunny day, getting one of these is a must. There are many tools that give us creative control over our films, with many of them being available from any camera. With a little more practice, we can use aperture controls to really dial in that look we're going for. I hope this taught you a little bit more about aperture, and its effect on both depth of field and exposure. Thanks for watching. This is Enix Blaze with Route 1 Reels, and I'll see you next week.